Welcome to Syntax. Today we have Marcy Sutton Todd on, who is a senior front-end developer, accessibility advocate, has a course on accessibility, just one of the, I think, top minds in the accessibility space right now of you're building a website, you're writing some JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you got to make sure this thing is accessible. She's one of the best. So welcome, Marcy. Thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff around accessibility, and I really hope to get a bunch of like practical things that just regular developers can get out of it, because honestly, I think that's like one of the biggest spaces that developers need to improve, which is like not that every single person needs to be an accessibility expert. We certainly need those. We need reviews and whatnot, but I think just like the general knowledge, just like you have general knowledge of CSS, you should know about how to approach these things. Every developer kind of needs to know it. So you want to give us a quick rundown of who you are or what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Marcy. I am a front-end developer. I've been in the game for, so long. Too long. But I love it. I love building user interfaces. And somewhere along the way, I learned about web accessibility. And it was really working with people with disabilities that it struck me that, like, whoa, I could have an impact here. This doesn't work for people that I can even talk to and say, like, oh, tell me more. Tell me how this works or doesn't work for you. Like, that connection to people with disabilities is what super resonated with me. And I've never been able to turn it off. So when I build a user interface, whether accessibility is like a very clear requirement or not, it's a requirement to me and how I build things. Sometimes I put in that little extra effort, even though no one's asking, maybe even rebel a bit and just do it because it's work that needs to get done. And so in addition to actually building user interfaces, I've shared whatever knowledge I have with people along the way through courses, through workshops and talks, just because it seemed like if we tell our friends and then our friends tell their friends, it can snowball into this thing where more people know about it and there's easy, approachable things that we could do to make the web more accessible. I just saw this lever of impact. Like, we could really make a difference here if we collectively know more and do more. So that's kind of been my mission for a while.
Nice. That's great.
Yeah.
I really like this so you have this course, testingaccessibility.com, and I was scrolling through like the list of tech in it, and it looks like you're covering like React hooks and refs and portals and things like that, which I think is why I asked you to come on here, because you are not just the accessibility person who tells people what they're doing wrong. You're a front-end developer, right? Like, you actually know how to build this stuff from the get-go. Is that fair to say?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, the wag of the finger, the kind of frustration that I totally get now that I've been in accessibility for a long time. I just didn't feel like that was really a great way to influence people and to make an actual difference. Like, certain tones might stick in people's minds, but if you want to influence people to make change, you have to kind of persuade them to do it. And so making it like, hey, the cool kids are over here. Like, people are going to build stuff with React or with Svelte or whatever tool. Yeah. Like, users don't really care what tool you're using. We just want, whatever's ubiquitous in the industry, we want to make those web applications and websites accessible. So those are the tools that I use that I really enjoy. So a lot of my stuff does cover the tools using React or the React ecosystem. But really, any client-rendered JavaScript framework is important to cover because so many of these web apps are just like missing the basics.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of that, because I think a lot of our listeners, when they hear accessibilities, they might think, all right, I have to make sure it works with screen readers for my keyboard. What are the things, like the main things that you have to think about in terms of like supporting when you're supporting accessibility?
Yeah, the keyboard is such a big one. It sort of like screen reader support piggybacks on top of keyboard support, like they're related. There's nuances to both. So the keyboard support is always where I start, because if I tab through a web app or a website, I can usually tell instantly whether it is going to work or not. Can I see where my focus outline is? Can I even reach and operate everything that a mouse user could like hover over and do, menus and all of that stuff. Like, can I do it as if I had no mouse, no trackpad at all? That's kind of my first run through of everything. But then there's a ton of stuff in how you mark it up with image alt text and how you use semantic markup or not with your HTML to add headings and landmarks and lists and all of that goodness that you get from HTML. And then there's design aspects too, like color contrast. I think that might even be the number one issue on the web is contrast that isn't obvious enough between foreground and background colors. So there's tools that we use to highlight a lot of this stuff, like browser extensions, that with the keyboard test. Like, you could get really far with those two things, I would say.
There was a period of time where, like, all the design inspo on all the sites, Dribble and everything, had just, like, massively low color contrast until everybody took a step back and was like, wait a second. That's such a good one. Yeah, even today, I think we've all gained a bit of an eye for, wait a second. I think sometimes it can get tricky, but the super light gray on a white background is hopefully out of the trends space for now.
You would hope.
Yes, right. Yeah,
I still see it quite a bit. And even myself, I've written many websites in my day, and then you run the accessibility checker through, and you go, "Oh wow, I didn't even realize it." Because it's surprising the color combos that you think would be accessible but are not. Like, for example, YouTube Red with white text on top of it is not accessible, and I learned that because I was building a button on my website that said YouTube. And I had white text, and I just went to YouTube, color pickered their YouTube Red, and it flagged it. And it's just, you just got to bump it down just a little bit, and you can't even tell. But that's amazing. You would think, oh, that's no problem to look at that type of thing, but it flags it.
Yeah, you would think. Yeah, big brand colors like that you would think are accessible. But yeah, sometimes it just takes a little tweak. And so you just kind of slip that under the radar and make that change as a developer. But sometimes there's too big of a gulf, and you have to go back to your creative team and say, hey, this just isn't going to work. This like white text on an orange background. I get that it's our brand color, but we need a palette that actually works.
Do you educate design teams a lot, or is that something that I think developers and accessibility experts should be doing?
Yes, definitely. I would say collaborate is really the best way to think of it, is that we're trying to work together to solve like problems in ways that, we're balancing a lot of different priorities. And so if we collaborate, then it's more of a we situation and not an us versus them sort of thing. Because I'm always trying to like come up with the best solution that satisfies everyone's input. But sometimes we have these hard rules like this has to meet contrast guidelines. And so how do we get there? It's kind of like that's the process that I try and work within.
Yeah.
I always wondered alongside that like color contrast thing, and like we see now VS Code is shipping with a really nice high contrast dark and light themes. If you're building out a website and you have this concept of themes, like on the Syntax website, we have themes. Do you think every single theme needs to be accessible, or do you need to make sure that there is an accessible theme turned on by default?
I would say the default needs to be accessible for sure.
Yeah.
Because that way you're not forcing somebody who needs better access to go and change the default. So that's step one. I would say if you have a variety of themes for people to choose from, try to get them as close as you can, like if possible, but maybe you have a low contrast theme and you label it that. And some people might prefer it, which is what can get tricky sometimes, is that it's pretty much impossible to make something that's going to work perfectly for every single person and every single situation. So having options and allowing people to personalize a little bit, whatever ways you can do that is helpful. And yeah, maybe you have a low contrast theme. Somebody who suffers from migraines or, I don't know, is just like kind of overwhelmed that day, but they can see, maybe that would be what they chose.
I know I didn't think about that for a long time because I personally like the 000 black on things. I know there's like a billion posts that say don't use that. But I didn't think that was a problem until I learned about some people they get migraines from bright text on a infinitely black background, and that can be just as much of a problem as not being able to see it.
I was building out my Cobalt 2 theme. I don't know, this was probably 3 or 4 years ago when I was adding like TypeScript support for it. And by default, I picked like a pink for the types. And there's just something off about it that hurt my eyes. When you scrolled it was just a bit weird. And I was like, well, it's accessible, but I really had to tweak it because I don't even know how to explain it, but it just hurt my eyes to look at that specific pink. And you think about that, like, oh yeah, there's lots of people in different situations that could not like that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's a moving target, every
Yes.
day it's different. Sometimes if I'm staring at the computer, like doing a podcast like this or doing a talk, I actually have to leave the computer for a while to not get a migraine. And so you think about like for people who are coming back to your website on their phone or on their computer, that might be like so many things they've seen that day that could just tip the scales to like, okay, I have to leave the internet for the day.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about motion in that realm. Like if you have auto playing video or just motion that users can't turn off, they can't pause, stop, or hide it to invoke some WCAG terminology, then they're going to leave or they're going to have a seizure or like something really terrible could happen for people. So we want to work within WCAG guidelines and best practices to try and make the web safer and easier to use, which is a lofty goal. Sometimes it's hard to meet that.
There's a lot of like new things in CSS that are making this stuff easier, like very easily you can add a media query nested inside of your selector that says prefers reduce motion, animation none. Boom, you turn it off, right? Or you just globally disable all of your animations. So I'm curious your thoughts on some of the new stuff that has come to HTML, CSS, and what they're doing for accessibility. Maybe popover, dialogue. What are some of the other ones that Scott just did a whole talk on?
Oh, like contrast color eventually. Yeah.
Oh yeah, hopefully that comes.
Oh gosh, what a time to be alive. Good. Man, focus visible and focus within. Those are some of my favorites in CSS.
Oh yes.
Oh, they're so good because sometimes the alternatives to like the lack of these new CSS features or even in HTML,
Yeah.
the alternatives were so hairy to try and solve. Inert in HTML, that one's like, we've been begging for it for years and we kind of use it anyway with a polyfill. But these tools are so essential for certain tasks within accessibility that I can't imagine living without them. And focus visible is one where if you click on a button, it is actually focused. And so if you have the normal CSS focus selector, you will see it like persist. And I've closed those bugs on GitHub, like where people they open an issue and they're like, this looks bad. Like I clicked and it has a focus outline. And at the time, we didn't have any alternatives really. So JavaScript solutions popped up, various things that we tried to do to solve that problem. And then finally, Focus Visible made it so that you can style just the keyboard and then turn it off for mouse users.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Which works for most cases. It's really been helpful.
So should we be using like Focus Visible and then like Focus Within is when something is focused within another element, like a child is focused?
Yes. So Focus Within, I found really useful recently working on a mega menu. Like if you have, say you're tabbed down into a child within a big structure and you have some surrounding style that needs to be visible, like, a different background color or a border or, something that kind of like shows the overall structure of something, but you are focused on a child. Focused Within can give you that styling capability to like, style the surrounding context of something. And that one is super handy too. Using the not selector as well, like these combo selectors with like has or not. I've been able to do some very precise styling on accessible mega menus and things using those new selectors.
I did not even really clock Focus Visible. This is like good for me because I'm looking at this and it allows you to control the keyboard focus, which Man, I think that's going to make styling this stuff a lot less annoying to some folks, but also it's not always great to have a giant focus ring if you're using it by your mouse. So man, that's really great. What about, you mentioned inert. What does inert do for you?
Okay, so inert, this is a bit of a niche
Yeah.
feature. So it's a Boolean attribute you can apply in HTML to make a whole section of your HTML subtree like unreachable from the keyboard and a screen reader. So say you've got a modal dialog, you open that up and you want to trap, interactions within that modal dialog, but you've got all this interactive stuff kind of like visibly behind it. Like the rest of your page has links in it and buttons in it. So to make it so that background content is effectively disabled, if you have your modal as a sibling to like the main element, which contains everything else, you could mark main as inert, and it does require a polyfill right now, but it will put ARIA hidden if true on that main element, and it will also disable any tab index within it. And that's really the piece that, like, the alternative was a lot of DOM locking with JavaScript, which you can do, but I mean, it was tough. Like, it's way easier to just put one Boolean attribute on something. It will render that inert, to use the word in the definition. But it just really makes it easy to disable content that you're not supposed to be able to reach, including all of the children.
Yeah,
Nice.
we got bit by that on the syntax website because we had used a dialog opened modally, which is when it pops up, and then it made the rest of the website inert. But then we had a toast that was saying like successfully saved or something like that. But the toast was behind. The toast was in the inert, so it was not reading out to the user. It was not announcing it's saved. So the user would just hit the button. Like if you could see the website, it was actually behind it. So it was broken for like literally everybody. But it bit us. And do you have any thoughts on, are we overusing dialogues? Because anytime I have a problem with a modal or a dialogue, sometimes the answer is maybe you shouldn't be using a modal for that.
Modal section. Yeah, having like
Yes.
crab switcher in a modal. Yeah, I think it does get overused, just kind of like from a design standpoint, modal dialogues. So there is that issue. You just reminded me, though, that I have encountered that same problem. I think it was with Headless UI dialogue. They put things into inert. And I used to work on frameworks. Like, I get it. You're really trying to make accessibility just work from the framework level, but there's so many use cases that you can't anticipate as a framework author, as a library author, that sometimes those bugs crop up that are really hard to work around. And in the case of the site I was working on, it was a React app that had multiple entry points. So it wasn't like your typical React application, and the headless UI dialog component you just couldn't do anything other than, like, I think there might have been a intersection observer or some sort of like DOM API to like go and remove what headless UI had added, which was like super problematic to have to work around it to that degree. But you're right. Like, if you don't have the API control to be able to tell the library you're using, like, hey, only put inert here, or be more specific about it. Like, if you don't have those escape hatches, sometimes like people are going to abandon your library after a while, because like the accessibility improvements, I put in air quotes, it just sometimes it's too hard to say like this is going to work for every web app. And I've lived that. It's a hard line to walk, because you want to make it automatic. You want to do things like in the UI component library as easily as you can for people to adopt. But sometimes it can go haywire with the case of your toast.
Yeah, exactly. Luckily, it was the library we had set up for it worked really well, where you could have multiple toasts, and I think it just found the closest one. So I was able to just put the toast inside of the pop-up, and it fixed all of our issues, which I'm glad, because I don't know how we would have solved that otherwise. Like, we would have had to move away from using modal dialogues, and then you lose the inert, you lose the animations, you lose all of the benefits
keyboard
of
capture,
being able to do. Yeah, the keyboard capture. Let's talk about ARIA attributes. So somebody's learning to make their website accessible. I've heard that ARIA attributes are a last-ditch effort. Is that true?
Yes,
Or
and in most
last
cases,
resort?
I would say I would label it as an advanced tool because it's really easy to make your web app worse. Like if you don't know what the attributes are doing, and some great examples are ARIA hidden, which actually is what inert is applying for you automatically. And that one removes all accessibility information from a subtree in your HTML, so a screen reader won't get that information. Another one, and I cannot give you a bigger like caution before I mention this one, but the role of application, that one is also like, if you're like, oh yeah, I'm building an application, I'm just going to slap this ARIA role on here.
Okay.
Like, stop.
What
Don't
does that do?
It will change the screen reader interaction mode on Windows screen readers such as JAWS and NVDA such that it changes how the screen reader reads out elements. So for example, in JAWS or NVDA, when you are in browse mode and you hit the H key, it will cycle through headings. So it's like a way to read content. If you're in an input, like a text input or something that you actually need to type the H, the mode that it automatically enters, like it will type the H into the input instead of going through the headings. Application mode takes away that browse functionality. Like it puts you right into like commands go straight to the computer, which sometimes is what you want, but like it's so rare, and that is like the most advanced of advanced tools that like.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when do you actually need that? Yeah, what is that use case?
When you're building like Google Docs or something where you are replacing every single feature that you're taking away with some custom implementation, and then you're testing it heavily to make sure it works. Because if you take that stuff away, the user can manually like flip between browse mode and what are the two modes? I'm blanking on them, but you can flip between the interaction modes in Windows screen readers manually, but then it's not automatic. So it's like, it takes away some of the default functionality that websites have. So it's definitely more reserved for super advanced tools where you are implementing like all of these features that you're taking away. So if you're Google, maybe, but even then, like you have to test things very heavily with people who use screen readers every day to make sure it still works.
Yeah, I guess that's a good question, or that leads directly into like the next question. It's like, how do you even test these things? Like, what are your best tools for testing?
Find people who use screen readers every day. That's and pay them. That's my biggest advice, because I am very much a novice screen reader user, and that's okay. Like, I don't rely on them every day. I know a lot of the pitfalls and, more than most developers would, but I get it wrong sometimes. I'll be like, wait, what's that command again? What's the name of that browse or that interaction mode again? I don't remember. So I have to look it up. And I think where it really becomes tricky is when you're filing issues against something. Is it a legitimate issue, or did you actually like capture like the state of something for someone who relies on a screen reader every day? Some of the stuff is easy to find, and the browser extensions that we use in the industry can catch some of this stuff, but it's not going to give you much in the way of user experience, So I would say work with groups like Fable out of Toronto. They are awesome in connecting you with people who use assistive technologies and other ways of navigating too, like someone who uses, screen magnification or, all different kinds of things that can help you get out of your like biased zone that you live in every day. That would be my best advice.
We've talked about this for a while. I think we need to make this show is just a couple people with disabilities browsing the web, because probably 10 years ago, I watched a blind guy use an iPhone, and it was mind-blowing to me how they did it. And I was just like, that was like so good for me to understand how people with disabilities use the web. And I think like more people need to just watch how this works rather than like, of course, these rules and all of these tools that tell you about color contrast and you don't have an alt tag, those things are really important, but also understanding, like you said, how they use the web is super important as well.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
We've often say, oh yeah, use a screen reader, try it. See, but like that isn't how these folks are using it. They're experts at their devices. They know how to use it way better than you could possibly ever pick up in a couple of minutes of trying a screen reader for the first time.
Well, yeah, and then people have different preferences too. It's like
Totally.
there's no one size fits all. Screen readers are configurable. There's so many different ones. So I think in the practice of observing someone who uses their tools every day, you might pick up
Hmm.
different things, and then we try and apply them to make something that works for a broad range of people. I think the browser extensions and the tools we use as developers, like that can take out the easy stuff. Like you forgot alt text on your images, or
Mm,
maybe even something more advanced with ARIA. Like maybe you put a roll of menu on your ULs, but you didn't do the rest of the pattern that goes along with it. Like some of that stuff you can kind of rule out ahead of time before you engage with people with disabilities who are going to review your stuff, just to make
Hmm.
it so that like they're spending their time on the more nuanced user experience type issues. But yeah, it's really, we have to remember what this is all about. Like, I recently worked with a team who was producing a presentation on accessibility for a client, and it was literally like all about compliance. And I don't even think they mentioned people, like at
Oh
all.
man. Like, don't get
yeah.
sued, and like you have to legally do
There
this.
were this
Yeah.
many lawsuits in 2023, and my
Yeah.
Oh
my
my
biggest
gosh.
message to them was like, let's focus on what this is about. Like, this would
Yeah.
be the driest, most boring presentation of all time if you're only talking about compliance, and you're going to miss the point. So it just,
Yeah.
that was like my best feedback to people, was like really understand what accessibility is about and who it's for. And it's really to remove barriers to access for people with disabilities.
Man, I just saw a tweet today about somebody asking Tim Cook about what was it about? Man, did they only do X, Y, and Z feature because of government expectations, or like did you consider the cost that it would take to implement these accessibility features? And Tim Cook's response was, when we work on making our devices accessible to the blind, I don't consider the bloody ROI. Like that's it. He's talking about the people. Like
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such a good quote for that.
that's cool.
On that same point, like obviously it'd be great to hire somebody to test your application, but at a certain point, like developers just want to be able to test it themselves as well, right? And I know there's probably two big screen readers, NVDA, non-visual
Desktop
desktop,
access. Ooh,
yeah,
developer
and there's
trivia.
JAWS, yes, and JAWS, and then, but like most of the people listening to this are sitting in front of a MacBook Pro and don't have like a Windows machine handy, especially now that IE testing is no longer a thing. Is the Apple Accessibility Reader, is that good? Is that good enough? Is that a good way to test your applications?
Yeah, so VoiceOver is the screenware on
Yep.
OS 10 and iOS, and it's great. It works really well with Safari. So for developers that are like, we don't test in Safari, it's like, well, if you're going to test with VoiceOver, it's going to work best with Safari. But I would say it's still possible to make something that works in VoiceOver that does not work very well on Windows screen readers, and that is missing a lot of where people navigate who use screen readers every day. And the
Hmm.
data that I get that from, we can't track screen reader usage for privacy reasons. We do have the screen reader surveys from WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, and it's skewed pretty heavily toward like web professionals in North America also. But it's still the best data we have on like which screen readers are used the most, including mobile devices. And so for that reason, I would say for developers, at least somewhere in your software development lifecycle, even if VoiceOver is like your more regular screen reader you test with, personally, I still use a virtual machine to test on Windows. So Parallels is pretty solid. I mean, it does cost money, so your organization hopefully will pay for it, at least like by some means. Because, yeah, VirtualBox and the IE developer boxes, like those are long gone. But you can test with Parallels. NVDA is free and open source on Windows. So it is helpful because those screen readers work differently. Like those interaction modes I was talking about, those aren't part of VoiceOver. So like you could put a role of application in your app and totally hose Windows screen readers. You
Yeah.
might have different results in VoiceOver. So
I actually had somebody ask me when I posted about that fix I had. They say, well, does it, of course it works in, sorry, what's it called? The Apple one called? VoiceOver?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what about JAWS? I would think, not knowing, most people use like the Mac VoiceOver. You know, most people are on iPad or whatever, but it's not. It's 10% people using VoiceOver, and then probably 80% between JAWS and VDA. So I was really surprised at that. So I thought, and I went and downloaded a VM and got it running. Actually, no, I used some website where I had a free trial, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
could use it.
That's super worth mentioning, actually. So the virtual machine is like what I do personally,
Yeah.
because I just want that control and all that stuff. However, there is a service called Assistive Labs, and they have like a cloud-based solution that would be another option for organizations to try and test cross-platform.
Yeah, it was great. I was up and running pretty quickly, and then you can of course buy a monthly. What is it? $19 a month. You can get 120 testing minutes a month. So it's not cheap. It's probably cheaper to go get a Windows laptop or run a VM, but you can get up and running with this extremely quickly. Especially if you have an issue, you can go from having an issue to testing it in like 3 minutes.
Totally. Yeah, and it is worth it. I remember I used to write a blog called Accessibility Wins, which I gave up on because it's actually really hard to find wins. But I wrote up something that I was like, yeah, this works great in VoiceOver. Yeah, guess what? It didn't work well on Windows screen readers. So I had I had to redo it. It was super embarrassing. So I've learned that like in my core being that like you have to test it in Windows screen readers. Primarily because that's where people use it the most, you know, on like for anyone using a desktop machine with a screen reader. Yeah, JAWS and NVDA. Fortunately, they do work very similarly. So most issues you could test in NVDA.
And if you want to see all of the errors in your application, you'll want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. You don't want a production application out there that, well, you have no visibility into in case something is blowing up and you might not even know it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Again, we've been using this tool for a long time and it totally rules. All right. Why do you think it's so hard to get these things right across all devices?
Well, screen readers aren't standardized for one. So there's nuances like in how ARIA is, like how that's interpreted. Yeah, they're commercial software products, like at least in the case of JAWS. Yeah, just like every tool has a slightly different approach to things that is reminiscent of how web browsers have been in the past too. Fortunately, it's become pretty stable. But yeah, it's a really good question. Like, why is it so hard? Sometimes I think it's because they're pretty advanced tools doing advanced things. For JAWS, I know that it does look at the accessibility tree and the DOM. So that's not always the case in screen readers. Like, how much does the screen reader go into your HTML to evaluate it? I think JAWS started doing that just because it was like the accessibility tree just didn't have as much in it. Maybe ARIA, I don't know. There's all kinds of reasons. But yeah, it's different in every screen reader, which is why those numbers, like the WebAIM metrics, are really helpful because it gives us some direction to follow. And if you look at how much of your traffic is in a given browser, like, wow, we get a lot of traffic on mobile. You could use that to kind of guide you toward the WebAIM screen reader survey and say, okay, for this mobile browser, I can see in the survey that users use, X screen reader the most. So it's like those metrics can at least help you narrow down what to test. Because like we only have so much time to test everything in our test matrix. And then you add screen readers and like the fact that we don't have the skills in the industry to do it well, like you have to prioritize something. So
yeah,
that's how I think about it.
Can you explain how somebody with a disability moves around a website? Like, of course you can tab, right? But not everyone's sitting there tabbing through 1,000 links to get to the content, right?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that like disability is not a monolith. And so everybody's going to have a different way of navigating. Yeah. And people might even have multiple disabilities. Like it's so varied. I mean, people are just as different as different could be. So I would say for someone who is blind or low vision and is using a screen reader, and a big caveat, like I don't use a screen reader every day, but this is where semantic markup becomes very helpful because you can navigate by headings. So you mentioned the tab key, but a lot of users navigate by headings using that H key I mentioned on Windows screen readers. That will just take you through every piece of content that's marked up as an H1 through H6 heading. It'll announce, what heading level, what the text is, kind of depending on how your screen reader is configured. It will potentially read a summary of the page when you land on it. You might hear lots of other information like what semantic landmarks an element is inside of. Like if it's in a nav, you might hear it say like nav H1, whatever the content is. Like all of that information that's kind of surrounding your actual text. Like, is it in a list? Is it a form input? Like all that goodness, like that's in there for a reason. And it's because it all can be announced to a screen reader. So yeah, there's headings. You can navigate by landmarks. In VoiceOver and NVDA and probably JAWS, there are collections that you could go through. So in VoiceOver, it's called the rotor. In NVDA, it's called an elements list. You could pull up all the headings, like there's a dialog you pop open. It can show all the headings or all the buttons, and it'll give you a whole list of everything. So that's another way to jump through content. Yeah, there's so many different ways to navigate. I guess one gotcha that I will mention if you're kind of just getting started with supporting screen readers is that not everything needs to be interactive for a screen reader to announce it. So a heading is not an interactive element. It's a text content element, block level. And so you don't need to put tab index onto a heading for a screen reader to reach it. You don't interact with it. You're just reading it. So that's kind of the biggest like upfront tip I could give is that know that navigating like browsing content to read it, you have commands in the screen reader that support that. You only need to make interactive things that actually do functions like toggling functionality or linking to another page or an internal jump link or a form control. Like those are interactive. So those need to be reachable with the keyboard either by like default, elements that are focusable by default, or you can do a custom tab index implementation with all of the other requirements that go along with it, which are ARIA, keyboard events, like an HTML button. You can go so far with that for anything that like needs to do functionality in your web app because of what it gives you for free. So like the other big caution I would give you is if you're putting tab index on elements, make sure they're actually fully interactive. So like do some searching on the internet of like how to make a custom widget. Maybe the ARIA authoring practices guide would be a good place to look. Those patterns aren't production ready, but they're really informative to give you like ideas on what the conventions are.
I built my own drag and drop, and I built the drag and drop in no time at all. And then I went to make it accessible, and I was like, I need some good examples of how do you make drag and drop accessible, right? And we had Alex on from Pragmatic Drag and Drop, and he kind of explained how to do that as well. So there's a lot to it. Those little recipes, tabs as well is another thing that people goof up all the time, right? And they have really good example of how to do tabs.
Did the drag and drop solution have an edit mode? Do you remember? You have to like enter into edit mode.
Yes. Yeah. The way I implemented it was I forget what it was. I hit a button and it entered into edit mode, and then I put something in. We can maybe talk about the ARIA live regions as well, or announcements to say like now editing whatever, and then you can press up or down and it would reorder it and then announce. Is that the way to do it? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of that is because of those Windows screen reader interaction modes. Like that's one of those cases where that role of application I mentioned might be appropriate is in the edit mode, but it gets really like detailed. Like that's kind of, you're crossing into very advanced screen reader usage there. And sometimes just getting stuff tested in front of people, like if you're building a pattern like that, if you can have screen reader users test it, that's going to be the best information rather than assuming that something works, because it gets
so complex. Can we talk about like live regions as well? Because like a website, you got text on there, you got images, right? Like like, I think we understand that you can make that accessible, but moving into building an app where a single page app, you want to save things, you want to delete things. When an action has taken place, you might like do it green or say saved. How do you tell a screen reader that something has changed?
Sure. Yeah. So you mentioned ARIA Live Regions. Those are a really helpful tool for when you need to make an announcement, but you're not going to move the user's focus. Because like actually, what we call focus management, like you've opened a dialogue or you're working in a mega menu and you hit escape and you need to like put the focus back to some other location. Like moving the focus will also announce something. So in the cases where you're typing and you're doing an autosave and visually you see a toast or, some visual notification that some action has taken place, a live region is a way to basically pipe that text information to the screen reader. So there's two levels. There's polite and assertive. Polite will wait for everything else that's being announced, like other, information about the element that you're focused on or any other things that are happening. So sometimes it can be a little slow, like the announcement comes after everything else.
Oh, yeah. Canadian mode.
Yeah. So the assertive will interrupt, but it will also stomp out any other announcements. Like that's the only thing you will hear. So you have to be kind of careful with it. You don't want to like go put our like live regions, like assertive live regions all over everything. Like any tool, you want to not overuse it. And so being kind of mindful about usage where, you have a single action. Maybe polite is the fine setting for that. Another area where some user testing could be helpful, or at least heavily testing it yourself, like trying to make sure. Like, I think the real question is this annoying or not? Like, is it helpful or annoying? That's kind of the big question.
Yeah, sometimes you try it out and you're just saying too many things, like that must be super overwhelming to use this thing. And I think some users are used to it and some users will speed the voice up like 10x and are amazing at it. That's when I watched the blind guy use an iPhone, it was just like, I think he had it on like 3x or something and he could understand it.
Yeah, it's funny. My speed that I listen to is pretty fast. When I hear something slow now, I'm like,
same.
I am listening to this quite fast.
Yeah.
But yeah, the funny anecdote I have about live regions was from a friend that worked at Facebook when it was still Facebook. But on actual Facebook, they have those chat windows that used to be docked. I don't know if they still are. I think now they ship you off to Messenger. But when it was in the actual Facebook like desktop web UI, you could have multiple chat messages kind of docked to the bottom. And there was a bug where it would auto announce like how long it had been since the last message was sent. So it was like 9 minutes ago, 4 minutes ago, 1 minute ago. And it was just like popping off all of these automatic messages as like time announcements, which would be really distracting from anything else that you'd be trying to do. So
because the DOM was updating, so it would reread it every time the DOM was updated?
Yes. And if you don't have a screen reader running, you have no idea it's doing it. This is the risk of ARIA, is that if you put these attributes on your markup and you don't ever turn on a screen reader, you have no idea that they're ruining everything.
Wow.
Man. Even on the syntax website, I opened a bug with the library used for toasts because it was doing some animation where it would create the DOM node and then add a class or something to animate it in, and then it would do something to animate it out. And it was reading the alert 3 times. I don't know why I opened a bug, but I'm assuming it's because it was updating the DOM 3 times. I don't think a class would trigger it, but contents would.
Or even just like a React re-render might do it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because the DOM, even if it doesn't visually look different, a re-render
It might be getting re-rendered. Yeah, so those are tricky. Sometimes, you get into scenarios where, you have to like make sure your live region is not part of the render tree so that it's like not getting, like say you just can't avoid some re-rendering. Maybe you have to restructure your components so that this part is not getting re-rendered over and over again. That sort of stuff is like, I love that. That's like super geeky problem solving that I am into.
I did look into it, and they were using a role of alert. So like no ARIA, but then I looked into what role of alert does.
Oh yeah,
And
that is
it's
ARIA.
yeah. Oh, okay. But it's not like an ARIA dash, right? It's just an
Yes.
HTML attribute.
Yep.
And that's equivalent to ARIA live assertive and
Yep.
ARIA atomic true, which maybe the atomic part there is what's causing it to start again.
Yeah,
So,
you can change, like, does it look at it? There's different parts of ARIA Live regions that you can kind of play with the settings of those things. So the roles, so there's role states and properties, right? So roles, you could put the role of alert on something. Say something already has a role, like it's a role of dialogue or, whatever the like role is that is implicit in the element. The ARIA Live version of that allows you to leave the role as it was, but also add this live region functionality. So that's why you have both
okay.
the roles and the properties. And yeah, there's all different settings, and sometimes they work differently depending on the platform. So take that with a grain of salt.
Is there any other like ARIA attributes that are either neat or underutilized, or your favorite?
Man, well, I guess the ones that I'm usually looking at, I pull up the ARIA spec to make sure I use them correctly, because there's things like ARIA selected or ARIA pressed that depend on what roles you're putting them on. So, like, I just did a code review of someone's pull requests, like in the last day of the job I just finished up. And they had put ARIA selected on something, but it didn't have the rest of the pattern that went along with it. And so that stuff's really easy to miss in reviewing it. You can just be like, oh yeah, that's interactive element. It's got ARIA selected on it. Cool, ship it. I actually did pull up the ARIA spec to make sure that, because I confused those. So I guess my tip would be like, double check. Double check that you're using it right, that you've got all the parts. Like, what are the allowed roles for an ARIA property or state? Can I use this on any element? I don't remember. I have to look that stuff up all the time. Just I'd rather get it right. But sometimes those attributes can be handy for indicating the state of something, like ARIA expanded. Or ARIA has pop-up I use a lot. Some of them don't really work that well, like ARIA controls, unfortunately, doesn't work that well. I guess another tip would be to look at, what is that? It's like the can I use for accessibility.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about this. Yeah.
It's a11ysupport.io, and it's a community-driven, like,
Cool.
can I use for accessibility, basically.
Oh, that's neat.
So you can contribute to it.
Yeah.
That would be awesome, because I think it is like any community effort. That's where the data comes from. So not everything will be covered in there, but sometimes that can give you a sense of like, oh, this ARIA attribute is in the spec, but it's not actually well supported at all. So it might not hurt anything, but it might not do what I expect either.
Can I ask now? I'm just turning this whole podcast into my own personal.
Yeah.
The only reason I invited you on is because I wanted free information. So you have a field set. This is something I do a lot. I have a group of fields that when the form is submitting, I want to disable it so people can't resubmit it or change some data while it's loading. And I've been told that you shouldn't use that. You shouldn't pop it disabled on a form while it's loading, because I don't know what happens. Is that not a good thing to do?
I have heard that as well. Yeah, I think enough people have said it that I definitely give like some thought to that feedback. And I think there's other ways that you could like make it so you can't double submit the form, like disable the callback function that's attached to, like if you're doing a client rendered form submission, just like do it in another way where you're not relying on the disabled attribute, because I think it does have potentially, and I have to test this, but it might have effects on the accessibility tree where like all of those elements are not readable or you can't tab onto them anymore. I know that for a fact. Yeah. But if what you're trying to do is prevent submissions, then maybe there's some sort of like a flag you could set that's like, hey, it's submitting, like a state variable that like, once you've clicked that, it's submitting, so you can't, like, the callback will just bail out after that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I like that answer a lot because it sort of cements the whole like tools over rules is test it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of these accessibility things are just rules that people like mantras people have. And that's good to a point, but you should also test it to see if that's actually true.
Totally. Yeah, I know. And even mantras I've had for a long time, I have to go test them again because browsers improve, tools improve. So screen readers improve. Like you have to go test it again and make sure that's still true.
Yeah. Like don't use placeholder text was one for a long time, you
Oh,
know?
yeah.
But I'm pretty sure, again, we should test it, but I'm pretty sure a placeholder text without a label is fine, or like a hidden label maybe.
Yeah, so that is an area where the tools improve because there were so many form labels that weren't labeled or form controls that weren't labeled, but they had placeholders. It was kind of a net gain for users to expose something, you know? It's like it had a placeholder on it, so why can't that be the label? Yeah, I don't love that, but I am happier that a lot of form controls, you can at least figure out what they're for now. And so what they did is they made placeholder part of the accessible name calculation specification, which is very geeky spec on like how does like a form label, like does that win out over an ARIA label attribute, or like how does placeholder factor in? Like there's a ranking of which one will win. And my favorite tool for testing it is in Chrome DevTools, the little accessibility inspector. It's in like the elements pane over by styles and computed, like down in that corner. If you kind of go into that tool set, there's an accessibility pane and it will show you accessible name calculation, like which thing won, or is there an accessible name at all? So that tool, like whenever I show that one to people, it's like, whoa, I didn't know this was here. And it is so useful.
Oh wow!
So
I
you'll
didn't know
see
about. I knew about that tab, but I didn't know about the accessible name.
Yeah, so now you'll see placeholder. It's in there because they added it to the spec. I guess to deal with the fact that like so many inputs had placeholders but no labels.
Oh yeah. So I just went to Stack Overflow. I inspected their input, which does not have a label for like the search, right? And then it says name search, and then it says okay. Well, obviously it doesn't have a label, but it says search, and then it says, well, there's no ARIA label by, but there is an ARIA label called search, and then it goes down and shows there's no label, there's no title, there is a placeholder, there's no ARIA placeholder, and there's no title. So it's, there's probably 6 or 7 possible ways that it could derive the name from. That's neat.
Yeah, and they can, like, sometimes you don't know which one's going to win. So that's where standardization and specs come in, is they give some order to this chaos of, like, it could be different in every browser and every screen reader otherwise. So that makes it a little more predictable.
So we had talked a little bit before about job market stuff, and I'm curious because being an accessibility expert in this role, what does the job market look like for folks wanting to get into accessibility work?
I would say, honestly, your best bet right now is going the general track and just having accessibility skills. Like, you can make an impact. It's a really tough job market out there. And I've seen a lot of accessibility experts get laid off. I mean, a lot of people have been laid off in general. If you're on that path of, like, trying to choose between, like, do I go the specialist route, or, like, I really like development, should I stay in general development? If you have the option, I would recommend general. That's a personal choice. So it's really hard to say that's going to work for everyone, but it's just tough. Like, that's how I've managed to stay in the game, is by getting better at my general development skills, because those are the kinds of jobs that I wanted and that I could get. The job I ended up getting is actually an accessibility position, but at that point I was like, I put so much effort into becoming a stronger developer in general that I was applying for general jobs and getting really close.
Yeah.
But missing out on, like, the people who were winning were, like, they had more experience in the exact thing that employer was looking for. And so there's just so many of us that have been looking for jobs that it's really hard to have the perfect background and the perfect experience for every single one. And there's just not as much, like, opportunity for a company to take a chance on you right now.
Yeah. So you think the accessibility stuff is a nice addition? It's a nice legitimizer into potentially getting considered for better roles?
Gosh, it's just so hard to like generalize for this
Yeah,
because
totally.
it's so
I
different
know.
for everyone. I just know that like I've seen a lot of accessibility specialist positions get cut in favor of tooling. You know, people want to build more accessibility tools for some reason, even though it's a very crowded space already. But yeah, I guess I would pose it as a question like if you're looking to get hired as, you know, for a job, like look at what's out there. Like what even is available? Like for some reason right now I'm seeing a lot of design systems designer roles, but not engineering. So like you have to kind of survey like what's out there, what are the trends, and then like figure out how you're going to play that game. Like how are you going to ride
Interesting.
that wave? Because I have pivoted multiple times and accessibility is something I just care so much about. Like I can't turn it off. But at some point, I made this choice that like I don't want to get too far away from actual UI engineering because it's what I love and there's just I have work to do in building UIs. And so accessibility is like part of how I do my work. But I kind of corralled back from specialization and even from DevRel into engineering and it was hard to pivot. Like I was kind of the underdog in a lot of cases, but I persisted. So like don't give up. That's kind of
Yeah.
it's kind of emotional thinking about it because I honestly almost gave up.
Really?
Yeah. I get
Yeah,
that.
me.
Yeah.
Like I have so much to say and so much to do and I almost gave up. Like it was so hard. I had 2 back-to-back job searches because the company I joined was great at first, but they got acquired. And just, yeah, it's super, super tough. And I know that people are getting knocked around. And in some cases, like, it's, well, in everyone's potential, it's survival. Like, you have to pay your bills. You got to keep your house. You got to feed your kids, like, all that stuff. And so it's stressful. So, like, what helped me was just really focusing on my North Star. Like, what am I going to be the best at? What am I going to, like, get out of bed every day and love? And I just kept laser focused on that. And it was super hard because I got rejected a lot, but I ended up getting a role that I'm really excited about. So just keep on it, you know, like really look deep in your heart. Like how much do you have in the tank and in the bank to keep it going? Because it's tough, man. So yeah, my heart goes out to anybody in that position.
Awesome. Can you tell us where so you just got a new job. Can you tell us where you're about to start?
Yes, I am joining Khan Academy on their front-end infrastructure
Yeah, nice.
team.
With
Yeah.
John Rezig?
Yes, with John Rezig, creator of jQuery.
Wow. We just had him on. He is awesome.
He's the best.
Wow.
I know, I'm thrilled. Like I could not be more
Congratulations. That's
excited.
great.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm stoked. Like the front-end infrastructure team there, it's something that John created. We hear a lot about infrastructure teams. You kind of think about DevOps, but he created a front-end infrastructure team that supports like across the company. And so accessibility is a really great place to put that. So like I was really going for like design systems, front-end component library type roles because I could insert accessibility as just like a commonplace way of working. Turns out Khan Academy actually is really putting a lot of effort into accessibility in the next few years. So it ended up being this really good fit for me and sounds like for them. And so I could not be more thrilled.
Man. Yeah, Khan Academy is increasingly one of the, I don't know, they've always been a cool company, but it just seems like they make great choices. So congrats. Yeah.
And like that seems like a neat gig because like not only is it a massive like platform, but it's also multiple languages, right? So you probably have to think about like how do languages and how do different regions play into this.
Totally.
Wow.
Yeah. The last
Cool.
slide I was working on some localization stuff, but it was in Adobe Experience Manager. So like very different tooling, but similar, like thinking about the user. I was writing some custom implementations to like handle redirects and like, you know, what happens in your like localization drop downs, like all of those details were fun to work on. So it's interesting going into Con because I'll be working on things that it could be in any part of the web application. So I'm pretty pumped.
Man, even math as well. That was one of my my very first hot tips was using the ampersand times HTML entity as an X to close a modal dialog instead of using an actual X because I like the angle of the X.
Yes.
But a screen reader reads it out as multiplication sign,
Oh, yeah.
So you have to make sure you put the correct labels on it so that when it is read aloud, it says close the modal and not multiplication sign.
Yeah, that's
Button.
where that ARIA label winning out might be what you want because you can
Exactly.
specify.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, and then trying to localize that. Like how do you localize your ARIA labels? So
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Man. Cool.
it goes deep.
Yeah. Well, let's move into the last section of the show we have here. I'm sure we could talk forever. There's one thing I'll tell the audience is Marcy's Twitter has a whole bunch of van life stuff, and she's a gnarly van that you live out of, or you go on adventures on.
I've had multiple vans in my life. There was a Ford van that you might be thinking of that was in a past chapter of my life, and that one was like a wheeling Ford Econoline. That thing was nuts. It broke down a lot, so I have a Sprinter van now. I got tired of being stranded and having to buy a new transmission, so I'm in a totally different phase of life now with a Sprinter van and a toddler and a husband. So we really, really like going out to wilderness areas and just like dry camping, riding mountain bikes and hiking. And yeah, that's one of my passions.
Yeah, I got to get out there. I live in Colorado, so camping is something that we just keep talking about doing. We don't have a Sprinter, but our friends do, so maybe we can borrow that and get out there sometime soon.
It's so nice when you're laying in bed in your van and you hear the rain come down and you're like,
nice.
We are dry in here. We don't have to put away a wet tent tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like it's just, I live in Washington State, so it really extends the time of year that you could be out doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that so much.
Sick.
Beautiful. All right. Last section we have here is sick pick and shameless plug. Did you come prepared with either of those?
Ooh. A sick pick or a shameless plug. I did not come prepared with those. I apologize.
So, it's okay. We'll tell you. So a sick pick is something you pick that is sick. It can be an item, can be a movie, can be anything in your life. Doesn't have to be development related. It could be a chocolate bar an object that you really enjoy. And then a shameless plug is just a plug.
Sure. Okay. So my sick pick, it's very top of mind, would be my electric mountain bike.
Ooh.
There's a Yeti 160E, and I rode it 41 miles and 6,000 feet of climbing this weekend.
Wow.
Almost killed the battery, but it survived. That was the game. Is how long can I make this battery last? Oh, man. Yeah, the E mountain bike. If you can ride bikes, the E version. I was kind of a holdout, but it is the most fun I've had on a bike ever. Yeah, for the bike people. It's a 29er mountain bike, and I just adore it. So that's my sick pick. I guess a shameless plug would probably be for testingaccessibility.com, my online courses.
Beautiful.
Yeah, those are awesome. Wow.
All right, everyone, go buy the course right now. Obviously, you've heard from this entire interview. Marcy's a real one. She knows what's going on, and this is fantastic. Thank you so much. I learned so much about accessibility on this one, and I felt like I had a pretty good handle on it. So I appreciate all your expertise here.
Same.
You're so welcome. Yeah, there's always more to learn, and be nice to each other. We're all in this together. I feel like I saw you ask a question on Twitter, and it just I'm like, oh man.
Yeah.
I just stay out of those now because how do you want to spend your energy? I want to just do the work and not be talking about doing the work quite as much.
It's a funky space because I've always asked God about this, and like you can't necessarily say it publicly, but I guess here we will. Is like there's a lot of people in the accessibility space that are not nice, and they take their aggression on or shaming of a website for not doing it, and then like. Anytime I ask about accessibility things, people are fighting nonstop in the replies. It's not good because it makes people not want to ask questions about accessibility because they come out slinging, do you hate blind people? Of course not. So they don't say that, but like that's the kind of the vibe I get from some of these people. Yeah. And it's hard because these people care so much about making the web accessible to everybody. And it's a very important thing. But can also be a bit of a turnoff to some people when you come on too hard.
It totally can. Yeah, I have been there. I've been frustrated. I guess the best advice I ever got was like, if I was shaming a website, someone said to me, "It's not unique to them." And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, well, then I kind of like released my clutches. I'm like, oh, you're right. And yeah, I just tried to be more, I don't know, measured about it because it just, I don't know, I just kind of maintain a happier life myself that way and try to influence people in ways that like they feel good at the end of it and not like they've been scolded.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Marcy, I read a book called Super Communicators, and that like unlocked a lot for me in terms of like how you talk to people to impact change. And it's like, what doesn't impact change and what shuts people down and all this stuff might be an interesting read, but definitely change my perspective on things as well.
That sounds useful. Yeah, it's not always easy. Like in work life, I feel like I do a pretty good job of it. I need to do it like in the rest of my life too.
I know. Yeah.
Frazzled and dealing with toddlers and all that
Yes,
stuff.
toddlers.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's the toddlers.
The toddler.
Yeah.
We know that.
I was telling my wife that the other day. I was like, I can spend all day being polite to strangers on the internet, but when my kids are mouthing off to me, man, that is the hardest part of my day.
Yeah, kids are crazy.
I have this like forced smile that I do that just like it changes everything. I'm like, I'm smiling. I can't, that's just the only thing that I can that comes out. So that's my device. To keep things positive.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. We'll catch you later.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys.